Thank you, Sky. Thank you all for being here with us today. It's a humbling and challenging experience to talk about foreign policy or American politics in front of a group of people who are active in the World Affairs Councils, because we know that you are among the most erudite and engaged people, civilians in the country. So that's by way of saying, please hold us to a low standard. We have here a panel of, with my own exception, very distinguished journalists, all of whom have worked at one time or another as foreign correspondents in places like London and Iran and Moscow and Kiev and Kabul, but whose current distinction and the reason we're in front of you today is that we have been brave enough to venture to places like Cleveland and Las Vegas and the suburbs of Philadelphia. Here's what we're going to try and do today. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do a very quick 3 to 5 minute sketch of some high points on his or her topic. Other panelists will be able to weigh in and disagree on that. We'll try and keep that to a half an hour or so at the top of our session, but we do want to get as quickly as possible to your questions and comments so that we can engage with you that way. So we'll first ask Ron to talk about what happened in this election, Jerry to talk about what it means for the White House and Congress. I'll say a few words about foreign policy per se, and Christia will talk about the economic and trade agendas and the impact there. So, Ron, what just happened?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for elevating me to foreign correspondent experience. Although I only had about 4 months in Japan once, so I'm not quite in the same class as the others on that front. But what I do is cover American politics, and you know, to understand this election, let's just first take one step back and say that 2 years ago at this time, Barack Obama won the most decisive victory for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1964. First Democrat since Johnson, only the second since World War II to get to past 50.1% of the vote. 365 electoral college votes, won 9 states that voted for Bush in 2004, 7 that voted for him both times, 4 that had not voted Democratic more than once since 1964. That was where we began this cycle. And by the way, Democrats began the cycle with larger majorities in the House and the Senate than the Republicans achieved at any point during their 12 years of control, from 94 to 2006. What we experienced was about as close as we can get in the U.S. to a parliamentary election, I believe. You know, the Congress is functioning more and more like a parliamentary institution. The levels of party line voting, Republicans voting with Republicans, Democrats voting with Democrats. The political scientists who have tracked this over the long term tell us that the levels of party line voting in this last Congress were the highest since Reconstruction. And we saw on vote after vote, essentially one governing party imposing its agenda, an opposition party resisting that agenda. So at the end of that cycle, perhaps it's not entirely surprising that we end up with a parliamentary election, particularly in the House. President Obama, whether he campaigned or stayed away, loomed heavily over the results. In the national exit poll, 85% of voters who said they approved of the president voted Democratic. 86% of those who disapproved voted Republican, very similar to the patterns in '94 and 2006, which also were both kind of quasi-parliamentary elections. White voters who disapproved of President Obama voted 9-1 Republican. And as you kind of take that broad thing and see how it plays out within the actual contests, there are 125 House Democrats on Election Day in districts where Obama carried at least 60% of the vote 2 years ago. None of them lost. There are another 48 House Democrats in districts where he carried between 55 and 60% of the vote 2 years ago. Only 6 of them lost, with 6 still to be counted. So out of the 173 House Democrats in districts where Obama was at 55% or above 2 years ago, only 6 at this point have lost, though it might go up a little bit. Very different picture when you get a little down in his situation. There were 35 Democrats in districts that he won, but he won with less than 55% of the vote. 21 of them have already lost, with 2 more to be counted. And perhaps most strikingly, the number that may be the most familiar out of these is that there are 48 House Democrats in districts that voted for John McCain, 36 of them have lost. 3/4 of them were defeated. And these tended to be blue-collar, downscale districts. I'll come back to that in a minute. But bottom line, districts where Obama was over 55%, only 6 of 173 lost. Under 55%, 57 of 83. More than 2/3 of them were defeated. In the Senate, there was a little more capacity for candidates to achieve separation in Nevada and in West Virginia. Harry Reid and Joe Manchin won despite low approval ratings for the president. But even there, the relationship is pretty strong. Apart from Nevada and West Virginia, Democrats lost all of the contested races, Senate races, in states where Obama was at 46% or below. Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, New Hampshire, Ohio, Wisconsin, according to the exit poll. Where he was 47 or above, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, and Washington. They won. The only exceptions to the pattern were Illinois, interestingly, and Pennsylvania. The only 2 states where Obama was at 47 or above, the Democrats lost in that. And the reason they lost was very particular in both cases. Overall, what we saw in this election was not necessarily a collapse of Obama's coalition, but an erosion of it and a diminution of their turnout, and then a really sharp movement away from the Democrats among the voters who were kind of cool. Voters who were cool toward him in 2008 became ice cold in 2010. The heart of the Democratic coalition, I'll try to be quick here, the heart of the Democratic coalition, the modern Democratic coalition, what elected Obama, what I've called the coalition of the ascendant, are young people, minorities, and college-educated white voters, particularly women. Democrats slipped among those groups in 2010, but they really didn't collapse. I mean, they still won 2/3 of Hispanics, and Hispanics saved Michael Bennet and especially Harry Reid, where Sharon Angel's kind of race-baiting ad backfired on her. The African-American vote stayed pretty strong at 90%. Young people, 57%. College-educated white women wavered. I'll come back to that, but still, in the high 40s. Their turnout was down. The rest of the white electorate, though, and by that I mean blue-collar white men and women and college-educated white men, all of which tend to be pretty skeptical of government, they moved really sharply to the point where, according to the exit poll, Republicans won 60% of all white voters. In the history of the exit poll for congressional races, which goes back to 1982, no party had ever gotten to 60%, not even in 1994 among white voters. There's another data set that goes all the way back to 1952, which is the National Election Study of the University of Michigan, and in that, only twice before had any party gotten that high, 1974 and 1964 for the Democrats. The erosion was greatest among the blue-collar voters who have been skeptical of him to begin with and have been hit hard by this recession and also tend to be kind of dubious that government is going to do anything to make their lives better. Democrats only won 34% of those voters. I mean, just an incredible number. The white-collar voters were a little more diverse. Women were better than men. And the most interesting pattern, and I'll kind of close on this point, was we saw a really stark distinction in the way upper middle class whites behaved on the coasts and in the heartland. The biggest thing that's happened to me, in my mind, in American politics over the last 20 years that has made Democrats more competitive after Republicans dominated the White House in the 60s and 80s was that the minority population has been growing and the upper middle class white electorate, particularly along the coasts, has switched from being predominantly Republican to predominantly Democratic. In this election, by and large, in the coastal states, Democrats still did pretty well with those voters. California, Connecticut, Colorado, which functions as a coastal state, basically places where the upper middle class is somewhat more secular. In the middle of the country, there was no difference between the blue-collar and white-collar whites. They voted almost as heavily Republican. And as a result, when you consider that the demography is less favorable to Democrats, there are fewer, it's older, it's whiter, there are fewer minorities, there are fewer college graduates to begin with, and if they're voting Republican, you have a wipeout in the middle. Other than Vermont, Iowa, and New Mexico, after this election, there is no state that doesn't touch an ocean in which Democrats have a majority of the congressional district, congressional representation. No, just those 3. So the only kind of silver lining here for Democrats is that this continues, and I'll close on this point, it continues a period of volatility. This third consecutive election where at least 20 seats moved back and forth between the parties. Last time that happened was 1948 to 1952. Obama lost Democrats had unified control of government Obviously, in 2009, they've lost it after 2 years. Neither party has been able to sustain control of the White House, the House, and the Senate for more than 4 years, since 1968. So, and obviously independent voters who moved sharply to the Democrats in 2006, basically stayed there in lesser numbers, but still stayed there in 2008, moved back to the Republicans. Neither party has been able to achieve allegiance, lasting allegiance from those voters, in part because neither party has been able to solve their core problems, which is going to be the subject of an excellent book soon. That, I believe, is kind of the silver lining here, is that for Democrats would be, if there is a message for Republicans, it's don't unpack everything. And that's what I would say. Stop there.
Ron, let me ask two questions. One is, remind me, you mentioned that Democrats only win in maritime states except for Vermont. Yeah. As I recall, you had an earlier version of that rule some cycles ago, which was Democrats cannot win any state where cattle outnumber people.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, I like to say, I have said, and this was true again, I said in 2000 that George Bush won every county in America with a cow in it, except in Vermont, where you have the lefty cows that work for Ben & Jerry's. And that is sort of where we ended up here again. I mean, you know, this map, if you kind of look at the congressional district map, it's kind of a throwback to the 90s, when we talked about the Democrats as being a bi-coastal party and having this tremendous difficulty in between, except for portions of the upper Midwest. And we're kind of back there. I mean, this was a wipeout of really enormous proportions in the center of the country. I mean, if this truly was a parliamentary system like 94 and 06, this would have been a vote of no confidence in the government.
Okay, let me ask a different question. To ruthlessly summarize what you just said, two things happened to the Democrats. One was that shift of white voters and independents, and the other was turnout didn't happen. Now, turnout was foreseeable in a midterm election.
Right.
So this is a different way of asking, what does this tell us about 2012? If Democratic turnout among young voters and non-white voters had somehow been equal in this election to its levels in 08, what would we be looking at?
Well, it's really a good question. So both youth and minority turnout typically falls off in midterm elections. It fell off more than usual, particularly the minority turnout. Youth turnout has averaged 12% in midterms, 18% in presidential since 92. It was 11 this time, so it went down a little further. The bigger fall was in the minority share of the vote, went down from 26% in 08 to only 22%. That will go back up. I mean, it will not only go up to 26, it'll probably go past it. It will go to about 28%. Judging by the rate, if it continues to grow at the rate it has over the last 20 years, minorities will be about 28, 29% of the vote in 2012, which means that mathematically, if Obama holds them at the same rate that the Democrats have been doing, he could lose 60% of the white vote and get elected, which is at least in the national popular vote. His problem is that, you know, where that coalition was available to Democrats, with the exception of Pennsylvania and Illinois, mostly because Kirk and Toomey ran better with suburban white voters than Republicans have, and which Toomey, in Toomey's case, probably should have. Sestak probably should have won that race. I mean, he just woefully underperformed in the Philadelphia suburbs, even though he was from there. He held his own elsewhere. He didn't collapse in blue-collar Pennsylvania. Leaving aside those two states, where the basic Democratic coalition, where there are enough of those people, they kind of held on a lot of those states. Colorado, Washington, Connecticut, California. The problem is that in the middle of the country, that coalition by itself, even if it shows up, is not enough to win with. And you have to be at least, you don't have to win most white voters, but you cannot get wiped out. Lee Fisher, the Democratic Senate candidate in Ohio, won 29% of white voters, according to the exit poll. And, you know, the question for Obama is, you know, how much of this is permanent and how much is recoverable? I think there is more recovery in the upper middle class that's available to him than there is, and again, we can defer to her in a second here, then he won 40% of working class whites in 2008, which is not a good number, but he will be very hard pressed to get back to that. I would be amazed if he gets back to that again. So I think there is a path to victory, but it may require, I think it's going to be very hard for him to win the kind of medal-bending states that he won last time, and I think it may be, for example, in Arizona, a diverse state. They may have to kind of look to patch together the 270 absent a big economic recovery.
Christia, Jerry, any burning questions for the psephologist in chief here? A word I only get to use every other year. Okay, Jerry, tell us what it means for Congress and the White House.
I will say this before I start telling you what it means for Congress, which is that I'm from Kansas, and I'm now trying to figure out, as I listen to Ron talk, what the distinction is between the political preferences of wheat-growing states and corn-growing states, and those that farm dry land versus irrigation. But I guess next week.
Next week.
Okay. Exactly.
That's good.
No, you know, I think Ron has done a very good job of describing an extraordinarily volatile, not year, but period in America's political life that we're living through. And that's, I think, what we saw further proof of. And it was the result of a bad economy, obviously. That's a statement of the obvious, but also kind of a national mood. And I thought, to me, as we went through the year, and as we did the Wall Street Journal NBC News poll, which I helped organize, there were two numbers that I saw during the year that illustrated the mood as well as anything I could think of. The first one was, we asked several times during the campaign whether if voters were offered an option to check one box on a ballot and throw out everybody in Congress with one vote, would they do it or not? And all three times we asked it, 50% of the people said they would do so, which is, if you think about it, pretty astonishing. Toward the end, we asked a different question. We said, if you had a choice in the vote for the representative from your district in the House of Representatives between somebody who had 10 years experience in Congress and somebody who had no experience in political office whatsoever, who would you vote for? And 50% of the people said, I'd vote for the person with no experience whatsoever. So that's the mood that produced the results that Ron described. Now, often and frequently, and I think perhaps somewhat incorrectly, that was described as a mood of anger. I think that's a little off. I think, and somebody from Ohio lectured me on this during September, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought he was right. It was really more a mood of fear. This was fear that the country had lost its way, fear that the country was slipping, fear that the country was losing control of its own destiny. And the economy was a big part of that, obviously, but it was a little deeper than that. And so that is what I think produced the election results. Then the question that we all ask ourselves, and that I will address briefly here, is, what does that do to the agenda in Washington and in the Congress that will now arrive for a lame duck session next month, and then more importantly to start over again in January? And I think the overall effect of that vote will have been, and in the way it's being read by Republicans in particular, will be to narrow the agenda in Washington down to a few core subjects. The economy, obviously, which means job creation, spending, debt, and deficit. I think Republicans are looking at this and saying that's what the agenda is. Now, they will also say repeal of the health care bill is part of our mandate, but they don't actually, I think, believe that. I think they believe the people who sent them here want that to happen by and large, but they also recognize it's not going to happen. So I think the House will cast some votes to repeal the Obama health care, lock, stock, and barrel. They will die, those votes will die in the Senate, or maybe there'll be a coalition in the Senate that sends it to President Obama's desk to die, and then they'll go back and try to defund parts of the health care bill and stop parts of it from being put into effect. But I think that's an important thing politically for Republicans, but I think the core issue for the Republicans is spending, tax levels, and the debt. And that's really, I think, the overall and first effect of the vote is going to be to reduce the agenda in Washington to those subjects in particular, which is not going to be pretty, by the way, because really those questions get at what I think is the core issue facing the political system, which is, what is the role of the government in the 21st century? What is the role of the government in Americans' lives in the 21st century? That's really what I think the 2008 election was about. And people kind of thought, well, maybe it's this. And then they said, no, 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 no. Now we had another election, and they said, well, maybe it's more over in this direction. But I think until the country, and I don't mean the political class, I mean the country kind of resolves in a general way the question of what is the role that we want government to play in the 21st century, I think we're going to have a lot of swings back and forth. And meanwhile, in the next 2 years, we'll have a lot of ugly debates about issues surrounding that question in Washington. So I think you're going to have a lot of discussion about which government programs can go, which government programs can be cut in half, which defense programs are we willing to see go out the door, are we willing to attack entitlements or not. But I don't think you're going to have a lot of resolution of those questions. Republicans like to say that they are prepared to cut $100 billion in spending right now, which is fine, My question in response to that is, where do you find the other $900 billion in spending that you're going to have to do to attack the deficit? So even $100 billion in spending cuts gets to the low-hanging fruit, not the high-hanging fruit. There will be an exercise in December in which the Deficit Reduction Commission that President Obama appointed, that's bipartisan and bicameral, will either produce or not produce some kind of a report saying what might be done to attack the deficit. But I think in this environment it's likely to be minimalist in its scope and probably short-lived in its effect on this debate. I think there's a more important political date coming up early next year in which a lot of these conversations will crystallize, and that is somewhere in the March, April, May timeframe. There will be a need to cast a vote in Congress to raise the federal debt ceiling. This is already emerging as sort of the flashpoint in which the Tea Party people in particular and their friends in Congress, people who were elected by the Tea Party explosion in enthusiasm, if not actual Tea Party candidates themselves, are saying essentially, no, we're going to draw the line. We're not just simply going to do what Washington does and vote to extend the debt ceiling. We're going to extract a price from the administration for doing so. And the administration is likely to, in turn, say, well, you can shut down the government if you want, but that didn't work so well last time the Republicans tried that. And I think a lot of Democrats in Congress are going to say, you want to extend the debt ceiling? Fine, you vote for it. We're not going to. You wanted power. This is what you get when you get power. You get to make those tough votes. I think it's going to be a moment in which some of these questions about how much spending are you willing to cut are going to be forced to the front of the line, because Republicans are going to try to say, this is the price for raising the debt ceiling. You agreed to this package of government spending cuts, and I think Democrats are going to say, it's not what we read into the election. So I think that's the core of the debate. It raises the question about some other issues, what happens to them along the way, and some issues that are probably of particular importance to this group. So let me tick off a couple of those, and then we can move on. But you're going to talk about free trade, I know. I think free trade, and particularly things like the South Korean Free Trade Agreement, probably get a little easier to deal with in the new Congress versus the old Congress. Although it'll be interesting to see what the Tea Party caucus says about free trade. They're not free traders by instinct, and some of them are somewhat isolationist by instinct. And we'll see whether that is an overall drag. You also have new Republicans like Rob Portman, the senator from Ohio, who ran on in a difficult environment in an industrial state a platform of explicitly saying free trade is good for my state, it's good for Ohio, it's good for industry in the U.S. And he won by 17 points, something like that. He won easily. And by the way, his running mate, John Kasich, who ran for governor, also was attacked for being a free trader. He also defended a free trade position, and he also won. So we'll see about free trade. Immigration reform, I think it's less likely in this Congress. Again, the Tea Party influence is somewhat nationalistic. It is not for immigration reform. Both parties have a political need to deal with immigration, but they don't have the environment or the votes to handle it very well. I mean, the business community's desire to get more H-1B visas does not offset for Republicans the price of an immigration bill that has something that somebody can call amnesty in it, so I think that gets more difficult. I defy anyone here, maybe you know, I can't remember the ad I saw this year in which a candidate said something pro or con about ratifying the START Treaty. Maybe I missed it, and maybe in Vermont. But I assume because it can slip under the radar screen, it may be a little easier to just get it done in a lame duck Congress. But I could be wrong about that, because it's one of those things that I think Republicans probably don't want to take a stand on it. They probably don't want to spend a lot of time arguing about it. It wasn't the point. The easiest thing may be to just move on. But I'm just guessing there, because I got to tell you folks, I haven't heard any discussion about it, although there should have been. There has been a lot of discussion about another issue that I think a discussion that will have consequences, which is the demonization of China. This you did see in ad after ad after ad this year. That China is the enemy. China is destroying our economy. China is the problem. It's overstated in campaign ads, as everything is overstated in campaign ads, but it's the sort of rhetoric that has consequences in the long run. What consequences? I'm not sure exactly. But I don't think figuring out a rational approach to dealing with China in the next 10 to 20 years was a cause that was advanced in the campaign. Finally, energy. It was interesting. I did an interview with Mitch McConnell yesterday, and I asked him twice, I guess twice because I'm a little slow and I want to make sure I heard it right. I said, what can you agree with President Obama on. And both times he said, there's some energy things we can agree on. He said, clean coal technology, more nuclear power, electric cars. Those are things we can agree on. We can't agree on cap and trade, that's dead, but there are some energy things. And by the way, White House people will say the same thing. So I actually think energy is one of those sleeper areas where there might be some possibility, if everybody wants to show that they're responsible adults acting responsibly, then maybe something can happen. But that's kind of it. I think that's the agenda for the next 2 years, and I really do think that much of what we've had, much of what Ron described, sets up in 2012 a much bigger test for where the political system really is.
Jerry, let me ask you one question about the numbers in the House. Back in September, Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann from Minnesota announced that she was setting up something called the Tea Party Caucus.
Yeah.
And there was sort of a frisson of nervous laughter, and no one was quite sure whether anyone would join. And over time, over a very short amount of time, something like 100 members of the House conference joined that caucus. If you look at the House Republican conference in January, is the Tea Party half of that conference? Is it a dominant part of that conference? Is it a smaller part?
I don't think it's half the caucus. I think it's less than that. I think its influence on the caucus is much greater. By the way, I also think its influence on the remaining moderate Democrats, and there's only about 23 or 24 of those, is going to be enormous. And more importantly, its influence on, there's a group of senators, 23 Democrats run in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They come from states like Nebraska, West Virginia, Montana, Colorado, Florida. If you want to defy the, if you're a Democrat running for re-election for your Senate seat in 2012 and you want to defy the Tea Party, you know, good luck with that. So I think there's a Tea Party influence that transcends the numbers. But I would guess the Tea Party caucus, if it stands at 100 now, it's probably 150 when the dust settles next January.
Jerry, can I ask you a question? Which side do you think, if either, has more incentive to try to find agreement, or do they both mostly feel that they are better off sharpening differences and heading into 2012? What's sort of the, I kind of feel like the deals in Washington happen not so much because of the specifics of the policy, but because both sides have made a kind of fundamental calculation. They need to reach agreement. Does either side have that impetus?
Well, you know, this is where I think the interesting historical anomaly in which the House changed hands but the Senate didn't, and that's very unusual, by the way, is really important. If the Senate had changed hands, I think it would be much more important to Republicans to have some agreement than under the current circumstances, in which they can shoot free throws in the House, they can pass whatever they want, they know it'll die in the Senate or under the veto pen of President Obama, and they don't have to take the blame for it. Republicans in the Senate don't really have to take the blame for it. I think the Republican view that nothing really has to happen over the next year would not have been a sustainable one if they had full control of Congress, but they don't. I guess the bottom line to me is I think that it's probably more important for President Obama, but also more difficult for President Obama.
I'm going to ask Christia to speak next, because one thing we've established here today is that this election was about the economy and it wasn't about foreign policy. So let's stick for the moment to what the election was about, and then I'll finish up with a few things that it wasn't about, at least not directly. Christia.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. And I just want to respond to one thing that Ron said, saying that you guys, I'm Canadian by the way, you guys are moving towards a parliamentary system. You're making a very bad job of it. In an actual parliamentary system, if you actually control the legislature, you can do whatever you want. I was...
As opposed to not being able to do anything at all.
Right,
yeah.
right, exactly. Yeah. I was recently participated in a conversation between Paul Martin, the former Canadian Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, and Bob Rubin. And Paul Martin, probably his big accomplishment in Canadian politics was to balance the Canadian budget. And he did that having on the back of a big conservative accomplishment, which was introducing a GST, a value-added tax. But it was obviously really difficult. You guys are now aware of sort of the national tensions you have when you talk about balancing the budget, what do you cut, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, quite recently, Paul and Bob were talking about this and reminiscing on what it was like. And apparently, the day after the crucial vote in Parliament to balance the budget, Paul Martin was Minister of Finance, and Bob said to him, well, you know, how did it go? How many months of negotiating did it take? And Paul said, you don't understand. we control the party. It took a morning. We said, this is our budget, gentlemen, and they voted for it. So, you know, you're not, you guys still have a long way to go to get to that. Which is not a bad lead into what I wanted to talk about, which was the implications for the economic part of foreign policy of these midterms. And actually, I think that Jerry's point about START not appearing in the campaign is an important one, that really foreign policy right now, insofar as it figures in people's thinking about their domestic politics in the US, is really about the economy. So I would just like to just pick out 4 big issues that I think are going to be of concern to Americans and also to the rest of the world. The first one Jerry alluded to already, which is China and trade, but I would frame it in maybe a slightly more complicated way, which is global. I think this is the really big question, and if nuclear arms negotiations were sort of maybe the dominant issue of the 1970s and the 1980s, the big framework for the international discussion. I think the big framework for the international discussion for this decade is going to be figuring out global financial imbalances. And that includes figuring out what should the right exchange rate be, the right framework for figuring out the right exchange rate for the renminbi. But it also includes something a lot more complicated and which has never really been a subject of international relations between states, which is what should be a country's level of savings and what should be a country's level of consumption. And we're already seeing this with Geithner, with the Treasury going out and saying, particularly to the Chinese and to the Germans, we think you aren't consuming enough and you're saving too much. This is actually quite remarkable. That in foreign relations we would be talking not about, you know, how many guns people have pointed at us, and not about control of disputed islands, and not even about international emissions standards, you know, things that are about the collective international space. We are now in what I think are the most important discussions between countries, talking about what's your savings rate. You know, to the Chinese, we're saying, what is your national healthcare system? You guys have to improve your national healthcare system, kind of rich coming from Americans, I would say, in order that your people don't have to save so much money. So this is, I think, a really important, really complicated issue, and I think really, really difficult, because we have no idea how much tolerance national populations, not just Americans, but Germans, Chinese, are going to have for the global discourse starting to have some bearing on these sort of intensely personal, intensely domestic issues. Second sort of big issue that I think these elections will have a bearing on in the global discussion is US inflation. In some ways, you know, we're here talking about the midterms, but I think you could argue that the most important political event this week was Ben Bernanke and the huge quantitative easing program that he announced. And that is sort of fascinating because, you know, from what Ron and Jerry have described, I come away with a conclusion that there is going to be gridlock, especially Jerry's sort of final, I thought, you know, really fine analysis of the motives of the two parties. So really, the elected politicians aren't going to do anything. Meanwhile, we have the unelected head of the central bank announcing a quantitative easing program, which is almost as big as the stimulus was. You know, it's huge. And it is hard not to conclude, particularly if you are a foreign observer of US policy, that there is this kind of unspoken consensus that one politically less painful and maybe actually economically not so bad way to start unwinding this problem of a huge foreign debt is just print some money. You know, it's kind of nice if you're issuing debt in your own currency. Actually, you have the printing press, and you can just pay the money back by printing it and giving it to the Chinese. And that is a little bit what we are starting to see happen. And just as much as you have in US politics this demonization of China and, you know, an undervalued Chinese currency, is the culprit for U.S. economic woes, I think you're already starting to see, and I think you could see much more, a dynamic outside the United States of other countries starting to accuse America of being an unfair economic player, particularly if you see a lot more quantitative easing and people saying, you know, come on, you guys are just playing unfairly. Third point, which will exacerbate that second if it does happen, is what happens with the U.S. economic recovery. And, you know, oddly enough, the biggest concern that the rest of the world has about the United States, you could say the biggest foreign policy issue the rest of the world has about the United States is, will the U.S. economy recover? And everyone is, you know, hoping and praying as intensely as Americans are actually that it does, because this great, you know, burst of global prosperity we've had for the past 2 or 3 decades has been to a very considerable degree been powered by the U.S. consumer, who isn't consuming that much anymore. Final point on sort of big foreign policy issue. I think, and this is something that I think is already evident in U.S. politics, but will be more so globally, is one important thing that we're seeing is, we've been talking inevitably, since there's just been an election, about partisan divides. I think a really important split that we're starting to see is the different, maybe a tale of two cities when it comes to globalization and technology revolution. You're actually seeing some parts of America, some of the big multinational corporations, but also some of the really smart entrepreneurial business people, maybe particularly in technology and finance, but also some manufacturers for whom the global economy, the technology revolution, are absolutely fantastic. You know, this is a time when you can build a company, you can build a brand almost overnight, and the global economy offers huge success. It also means actually that your fate is much less tied to the fate of the country overall. That old line about what's good for General Motors is good for America, it's less and less true. And for me, a really important data point was the IBM third quarter results that were about 10 days ago, where IBM reported that in the BRIC economies, in the first 3 quarters of this year, their profits had gone up 29%. That's kind of amazing in a crummy world economy. And what was, I thought, even more interesting was part of what's driving it is this huge shift in just less than a decade of IBM from being an American company to being a truly global one. So in 2003, they had 7,000 employees in India. Now they have 75,000. And over that same period, that same 7 years, they have reduced their US workforce by 30,000. So it's now around 110,000. Not that much more than their Indian workforce. And this is IBM, you know, this is Big Blue, this is, you know, a pretty big, pretty old, we used to think kind of stodgy US corporation. So that split, you know, meanwhile, I think a lot of these heartland voters who Ron was talking about are having a very different experience of the impact, the twin impacts of globalization and the technology revolution. And I think these conflicting results of what's going on are going to be driving driving conflicts within both parties, actually, because I think both parties have a little bit of support from people on both sides. And then just my final point on one thing we should be watching, this is maybe a little bit out of my, I'm maybe a little bit venturing beyond, outside the reservation, but especially to Jerry's point about there's going to be a big national debate in America about the size of government. I think there's one country that Americans should be watching very closely, which is Britain. Britain had that debate before the election, and they made an incredibly radical choice. I asked an economist when it would be, you know, when we would start to see if that was working or not, a guy called Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winner, and he said, oh, in about 15 years. I said, oh, that's fantastic, you know, incredibly useful for policymakers today. Back to you. I think it could be sooner, and it could either be really bad or really good. And I do hope that Americans, you know, You know, maybe it's not going to be in campaign ads, but I hope that Washington will be watching that quite closely, because it is a real-time experiment in what happens when you cut the size of the deficit, but also the size of government really, really sharply.
Say one more word about the British experiment. If you were to try and translate the British experiment into an American program, what would it look like?
Well, what they've done is just under 20% cuts in government services, apart from healthcare and education, and that means about half. That means about 500,000 jobs lost. That's a lot for the British economy, just like that. British population is about 55 million.
But it also means big defense cuts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, defense they haven't shielded at all. The only areas that they have been concerned about is health and education, which had cuts but much smaller ones. But I think the really, you know, there's an economic question, which is, you know, by throwing that many people out of work so quickly in a weak world economy, are they just going to tip Britain into a much deeper recession? Or the Tory argument, which is everyone will suddenly feel confident the British budget is back on track and private sector will bloom. So
we'll figure out
see
if we're all Keynesians or not shortly.
Yeah.
Well, in 15 years.
We have a lab. I think it will be less than 15 years, right? But there's somebody is trying it out. So the rest of us are kind of lucky that we're not British, I think, because we can see whether it works or not. And, you know.
Will you send us an update?
I think other people will be watching too. But
all right, Krista, thank you very much. That's terrific. Now, even though we said at the beginning of this session and even repeated that the election wasn't about foreign policy, and I know that hurts me and almost everyone in the room to think about that, because those of us who spend a lot of our time thinking about world affairs and foreign policy in a strange way would like every election to be about foreign policy. I'm not sure. I think we should be careful what we wish for. But clearly this election will have an effect on foreign policy. And it's also worth remembering that the 2012 presidential election will be partly about foreign policy, and this election will lead us into that. So let me say just a few words about where we've been on foreign policy and where I think we'll see the immediate effects and where that will put us in 2012. Oddly enough, although it's gone almost unnoticed, the first 18 months of the Obama administration were, in a sense, a period of relative bipartisanship in American foreign policy. It wasn't the sharpest point of disagreement between the two parties, far from it. Yes, there were Republican critiques of the Obama administration, especially the decision to set a target date for beginning a drawdown in Afghanistan, but compared to everything else that was going on, President Obama got a pretty free hand for his policy of engagement on Iran, for example, which, if you remember the 2008 campaign, he was derided by Republican conservatives as hopelessly naive to think you could negotiate with the leaders of Iran, North Korea, and who was the third in the axis of evil at the time? Thank you. Venezuela.
Cuba.
That's right, Castro may have been part of it. The president got a pretty free hand on even on pressuring Benjamin Netanyahu on settlements in Israel, although that immediately ran into trouble. It didn't work. It was bungled, but essentially, and the president has gotten a pretty wide praise for the way he's handled the drawdown in Iraq. Now, in an era in an earlier era, we would have thought that this was the normal tradition of American bipartisanship, but we haven't really seen this kind of comedy for a while. Why was that the case? Well, in large part, it was because Barack Obama moved pretty smartly toward the center in foreign policy. His withdrawal from Iraq, the end of the combat mission in Iraq was supposed to happen in 14 months. The deadline got kicked out. In Afghanistan, when the military came in and asked for more troops, he gave them more troops. When they came in and asked for more troops after that, he complained about being asked for more troops and then gave them more troops. We will see what happens if General Petraeus comes in and asks, metaphorically, for a third bite at the apple as July approaches, and in that case the request won't be for more troops, it will be for more time. I think that one will be tougher. But I would argue that one of the effects of this election we just had and the new calendar that leads to a presidential election in 2012 will be what you might call the repolarization of American foreign policy. There is now, in the next 23 months, every incentive for Republican critics of the president's foreign policy, and there are plenty of them out there for plenty of good reasons, to sharpen those critiques, reasons that are both substantive and political. And I think we're going to see those in 2 or 3 areas. One of them will clearly be the most important decision that's already on the calendar, and that is the decision in Afghanistan. Will President Obama decide to pull the trigger on the drawdown that he's promised will begin in July? I think the answer is yes. The answer is yes for substantive reasons. He's spent a long time coming to that decision, and as far as we can tell, he believes in it on substantive grounds. And then the second is political. The main pressure on Obama on Afghanistan at this point is not from his right, it's from his left. His main danger between now and the election of 2012 is that an anti-war Democrat will run in the primaries. It's folly to predict an election narrative 2 weeks in advance, but it's always the most dangerous thing for any sitting president to have a challenger from the base of his own party. He wants to head that off. The easiest way to head it off is to do what he has already promised to do. But he wants to thread a needle. He wants to withdraw some troops gradually without creating chaos and without prompting David Petraeus to walk. That's not an impossible needle to thread, but it is the dilemma he faces. Issue number 2, Iran. A crisis, if it occurs, if Iran gets to the point of deploying a weapon, building a weapon, or announcing the capability of building a weapon, that, I think, will instantly be the defining crisis of Barack Obama's foreign policy in the next 2 years, and how he handles it will, in many ways, be his defining moment, certainly as a foreign policy leader, before the American electorate. It would be folly to try and predict how that might happen, except I will note that the administration's own people who are working on this believe that the Iranians won't get there in the next 2 years. They say they are working assiduously to make sure they don't get there in the next 2 years. And when one of the White House's top people on this was asked, well, do you really mean that your goal at this point is just to kick the can down the road 2 years? His response was, in the business of non-proliferation, kicking the can down the road for 2 years is a pretty major victory. So I think we can expect the can to continue to rattle down the road. The other unlikely outcome would be that Iran might buckle in the face of the economic sanctions that have been ratcheted up and, in effect, sue for peace. I don't think we need to spend too much time on that unlikely event. Barack Obama and the rest of us should be so lucky. Last major issue, again in the we should be so lucky category, is Israel. At this point, it's very tough to see conditions in Israel and the negotiations with the Palestinians getting to ripeness. If they did get to ripeness, that would actually be a dilemma for President Obama. There are risks inherent for any president in investing a lot of time in trying to negotiate a peace agreement in the Middle East. Not just the obvious risk of putting pressure on Israel and irritating Israel's supporters in the United States, among them the many conservatives who have moved over the last 20 years from the Democratic Party, Jewish conservatives from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, which has made itself the American party of Likud, as the Democratic Party has remained the American Party of Labor. But there's a somewhat more subtle danger for a president, and that is when the country, when the electorate is asking him to spend full time on the economy, Negotiating peace in the Middle East, we already know, takes, in the end game, weeks and weeks of concentrated presidential labor. Every actor in the Middle East has gotten used to having quality time from a president if they're really going to get to yes. None of them are going to agree to sign a peace treaty if all they get to talk to is the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor or even the Vice President, although Joe Biden would probably be a very effective weapon to get them to finally sit down and sign a piece of paper. So in a strange way, I think the terrible dilemma that President Obama may face is that if Middle East peace looks like a possibility, can he spare the time and energy to do it? It's an unlikely choice. Again, he and we should be so lucky, but that will be one of the problems he could face. In a more immediate sense, very quickly, we will face some challenges. The administration will face some challenges, I should say, in the new Congress, beginning with the START treaty that Jerry referred to on energy, trying to reassemble some kind of international energy, international climate change policy with cap and trade taken off the table as a possibility. And finally, the administration and the Democrats in Congress have been painfully trying to move step by step toward new openings and new exchanges with Cuba under Howard Berman, who was the chairman of House Foreign Affairs for the last 2 years. The new chair at House Foreign Affairs is, of course, going to be Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, a Cuban-American from South Florida who has no interest in relaxing the embargo. So I think that one is off the table. Now, this sounds like a dire picture. I'll close by saying, paradoxically, in a political sense, it may turn out to be a good thing for President Obama. A more polarized debate, a sharper focus on foreign policy, actually allows a president who hasn't done a half-bad job. You may disagree or agree with his policies, but there have been, I would argue, no major disasters on his watch, and that, comparatively speaking, is a pretty good record. That will allow President Obama to highlight his stature as a president who can operate in that field, and to bring his putative opponent's qualifications into question. And if he's very lucky and carries out his gradual drawdown in Afghanistan and has to withstand reasoned, sensible, conservative counter-arguments against it, he and his political lieutenants will do their best to cast the Republicans as the party that wanted a longer, a bigger, and a tougher war. And as he knows from 2008, that's not a bad platform to run on in front of the American electorate. And with that, I will take a question from Ron, and we'll go to questions from the floor, and from Christian.
A question real quick that goes directly off that last point. I was struck as I went around the country and followed campaigns at the ambivalence in many of the conservative Republican candidates about Afghanistan. On the one hand, particularly in some of the Tea Party candidates, there is kind of a clear pullback from the Bush vision of the U.S. kind of, investing blood and treasure to remake the world and make it safe for democracy. On the other hand, the natural Republican instinct to try to paint a Democrat as soft on defense was there too. And for example, every serious Republican Senate candidate opposed the idea of time limits for withdrawal or a set time limit. So I'm just wondering if in fact Petraeus and the Pentagon do resist the drawdown that Obama envisions, do you think there's a chance that the White House gets caught in a squeeze between congressional Republicans on the one hand and the Pentagon on the other, basically raising a lot of barriers or resistance to him executing the plan that he's laid out?
Yeah, Ron, I think there's a chance, but it's not impossible to thread the needle here. It's not impossible to give, because in fact, the Pentagon is not a monolith here. Mm-hmm. There's not exactly a Tea Party in the Pentagon, but there are generals. I think there's a line in Bob Woodward's book mm-hmm. where I think Colin Powell says to someone in the White House, may say to Barack Obama, there's more than one general in your Pentagon. You don't have to take the first piece of advice that's there. I think, though, yes, if Obama and his crew handle this badly, and it's possible, we don't know, that we may have a different Secretary of Defense mm-hmm. at the Pentagon at that point. So there's an X factor. Yeah, you could have some kind of split along those lines, and that would be dangerous. Now, I'll leave it to you whether in electoral terms you would rather be on the small war side of that argument or the large war side of that argument, but it is dangerous.
I have an Afghan question too, which is, to what extent do you think the economy will dictate the decisions in Afghanistan? You know, to what extent does it just become really hard to sustain a lot of spending in Afghanistan at a time when the U.S. economy is really weak?
That's a terrific question, because it has been striking how often, how bluntly, and how openly President Obama talks about the economic cost of the war and the opportunity cost of the war. The fact that to many of us who covered, to me at least, in the 2008 campaign, the Obama argument that by downsizing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we would have enough money to fund energy and education and health care seemed like kind of a trick talking point, and it may have been, but there's no question that the enormous drain on the budget of those wars weighs heavily, and I still think, in a sense, the most important speech he's done as president in the structure of American foreign policy is his speech back in December at West Point, when he echoed Eisenhower and said, we have to learn to live within our resources. And so in a sort of a concrete, immediate sense, no, they're not going to make the decision based on the dollar costs of different options. But in a much larger sense, yes, the framework of Obama foreign policy is intended to take us from a very expensive, neoconservative, nation-building, democratizing model of foreign policy to a much more economical model. Absolutely.